Well, welcome everyone to a special event here at Wolfson College, Oxford. And we're delighted to have with us Samanth Subramanian, who is a writer, a journalist, and is with us today particularly to talk about his new biography of JBS Haldane, and to talk about the life of this extraordinary person who has both a strong link to science and India and Oxford, but a very particular link to Wolfson that we'll come to later on. But let me just briefly introduce Samanth, if I may. Samanth graduated with a BA in journalism from Penn State University. He then graduated from Columbia in International Affairs, from the School of International and Public Affairs. He's written 3 books. So the first 2 books, one was a collection of essays about traveling around the Indian coast, and the other was Divided Island Stories from the Sri Lankan War. And then in 2019, he published the book we're going to talk about today, A Dominant Character. Samanth is also a journalist. So many of you who read The Guardian will know that he is a writer in the long read section. Any of you who read it this week will know that he wrote particularly about the Wentworth golf course, and he writes for many other magazines, The New Yorker, Bloomberg Businessweek, etc. So Samanth, if I may, just kicking off, we've got this extraordinary life of this Scottish English scientist, one of the most successful public scientists of the 20th century. You've written books about India and Sri Lanka. So can I just ask the connection, why you picked up this book as the one that you were then going to be writing about?
Well, I mean, there's 2 reasons, and I'll give you the writerly reason first before I give you the reason that has to do with Haldane himself. The writerly reason is my journalistic career has largely involved using a small set of tools to write nonfiction, to write long journalistic stories across a range of subjects. So if I wrote about Wentworth Golf Club in The Guardian this week, I wrote about airlines last year, and I wrote about vaccine technology before that. So my approach to all of these is usually the same, which is that it should be possible, given enough time, for me to be able to research an interesting subject and present it in a narrative, something that the lay reader can get their hooks on. And so I try to do the same with my books. My first book, as you mentioned, was a collection of travel essays. My second was about the civil war in Sri Lanka. And so I was curious to see whether I could write a biography. I'd written profiles before, but I was interested in an expanded version of the profile. But Haldane came to me specifically because I was approaching his life backwards, so to speak. So I'd heard of him primarily first as a British scientist who moved to India in the 1950s, lived there, became a citizen, died there. And because it was quite uncommon at the time, usually the movement of scientists was in the opposite direction, from India out to the West, I became curious about Haldane and what brought him to India. And I think if you do even the most rudimentary kind of reading about Haldane's life, even if you just read the Wikipedia entry on his life, you will see that he's lived such a dramatic, complicated, action-filled life, which is not something you can say for scientists very often. But this is a man who was in the trenches in the First World War. He was in Spain during the Civil War. He was a member of the Communist Party for years. The British government at some point suspected him of being a spy for the Soviet Union and spied on him for close to 20 years. He was relentlessly anti-establishment everywhere he went. And he was such a larger-than-life figure. And in the middle of all of this, of course, he managed to do extremely important work in genetics and evolutionary biology. And so this question of what happens when a scientist becomes a public figure, when a scientist realizes that science and politics are sort of inextricably intertwined. What lessons we can draw from that, what stories it has for us. I became fascinated by these big themes running through his life. And so that's how I decided that I would write this biography.
And there's a wonderful line when you reference the question of whether you're a spy or not. There's a wonderful reference where you say MI5 was his first biographer, that those curious gentlemen who sent little notes in describing what he was doing, and your conclusion is that he wasn't a spy in the sense that he wasn't handing material over to the Soviet Union, but he clearly had a very strong interest in the Soviet Union, and his views of Stalin were extremely glowing and positive views for many years. But let's then step us right back to the beginning. So here we have, well, we will have a number of people in the audience who maybe don't know about his father, and maybe it's worth having a little word about his father and his relationship with his father and how that started his life in an Oxford setting.
And I think that's really important. I think his father was a huge formative influence on JBS. So his father, John Scott Haldane, who was a professor of physiology at Oxford, J.S. Haldane was researching respiration for the most part. So he would analyze how the human body takes in oxygen, takes out carbon dioxide, how it reacts to other mixtures of gases, to other variations in pressure. But unlike many other scientists of his time, J.S. Haldane genuinely believed that his science was being done to benefit humanity at large. And so very often his work would be done not in the lab in Oxford, but out in a coal mine in Wales, where he would go down into the mines to examine the kind of gases that people were being exposed to. Or they would be done at the bottom of a Scottish lake, where he would experiment with diving suits and was actually the one who set down the tables that divers use to decompress, even as they come up today. So he was extremely involved in what I might call science for the layman or the layperson, and science to benefit society. And I think that was something that JBS kept with him until the day he died, which, even though JBS's own work was much more centered on pen and paper. He didn't do a lot of experimental work, unlike his father. But I think JBS too believed that science has a social purpose. And these, father and son, when JBS was still a boy, had so many adventures together, as I say in the book. I mean, JBS was sent down in a diving suit several sizes too big for him to the bottom of a lake, where he was walking around until he realized that the water was seeping in through the hinges and had to be pulled up as quickly as he could. And by the time he was up to the boat, the water was up to his neck, and he had to sort of be dosed with whiskey and put to bed and warmed up. There was the time when JS took JBS down into a coal mine and asked him to stand up and recite the funeral oration from Julius Caesar. And he could get only a few sentences in before he dropped to the floor, because the reason was that the lightest gases at the very top of the mine shaft were the ones that would cause you to lose consciousness. And so there were all these adventures that JBS went on that I think inculcated in him the promise and adventure of science.
And when you describe sort of baldly like that, the things that the father forced the son to do, you might think that there was some kind of sadism involved, but everything it seems to suggest that JBS himself really found it quite thrilling to do these extraordinary things.
Oh, absolutely. And I should mention that JS himself would sometimes subject himself to these kinds of conditions as well. Father and son both had a philosophy that a test rabbit is no good in an experiment, because a rabbit can never tell you how it's feeling. And so, especially with physiology, there was a real purpose to experimenting on yourself. But I think there was also a deep moral purpose behind these experiments, which is that I think J.S. Haldane, the father, thought that if these coal miners and deep sea divers and all these other working class men and women were undergoing these conditions day in and day out, there was a certain a moral rightness to undergoing it yourself as you researched these conditions. And I think father definitely took that quite to heart, and the son did as well. Many years down the line, during the Second World War, JBS would subject himself to very similar pressures and conditions when he was researching submarine situations for the British Admiralty.
And I mean, like father, like son, both extremely brilliant people. Son, I guess, like father, quite opinionated as well, very confident in his intellect. And one of the things, slightly sad things in a way, that you see in some of those early years is that when he's with his family, when he's with his father, doing these extraordinary things, he loves it and he thrives. And he goes to Dragon School just around the corner from here with his sister, who's the only girl in the whole school, and they just, they get guinea pigs and they try to do genetic experiments on guinea pigs. But he then goes to Eton, and that Eton seems to both cow him emotionally. Something happens at Eton, and it seems to create his politics as well. Do you want to just talk a little bit about how the complexity of his character emerges at that point, in a way that wasn't quite so obvious when he was thriving in this highly stimulating, highly demanding environment at home?
I think that's right. I mean, I think he was, he shared a really good relationship with his father, who treated him like an adult, essentially, ever since he was a little boy. And then he went away to Eton, so he was already sort of distanced from this family that loved him and that he loved. And he went right into this culture of quite relentless bullying, which was prevalent in Eton at the time, which took forms of physical abuse, but sometimes also sexual bullying, which I write about in the book as well. And he was quite unhappy, and he was unhappy, moreover, because he was not the typical Eton student. He was somebody who had a bright, alive mind, and was somebody who wanted to do things himself, but he was forced quite early to fit into a regimented schedule of study at Eton, and that made him unhappy as well. And so it was only towards the last couple of years at Eton that he found his space and he found his crowd. So I think the first several years of his life at Eton were quite miserable. And I think he tended to attribute that also to the class of people, the class of families that these boys tended to come from, which were traditionally patrician, upper class families, people he didn't quite feel comfortable with. We know that much later he goes to the trenches in the First World War, and that's the first time that JBS really feels he's among men who he feels a certain camaraderie with. People who look up to him, who respect him, and he respects them in turn. It's the first time he ever fits in. And I think that's quite a formative influence on his life as well.
I mean, that said, his parents were not from anything near even the middle classes, as you might describe in those days. I mean, they themselves were very well off and had a home in Scotland, etc. But they somehow didn't appear patrician in the way they behaved, whereas perhaps the people at school did appear patrician, or at least believed in a patrician approach.
I think that's right. And I think his father in particular, who was an agnostic, unusual at the time, he was extremely liberal, again, something that was unusual given his background, or given their family's background. I think his father had made great efforts to sort of break away from the traditional mold of the British patrician family, and raised his son and daughter the same way. And I think that was the disjoint that JBS felt when he went to Eton.
Now I'm trying to remember, I've forgotten the timing. Does he go to Oxford after that, or does the First World War intervene? So Oxford, so
he goes to Oxford first. After Eton, he goes to Oxford and he majors in the classics and mathematics. And then the war breaks out almost as he's ready to graduate, and so that's when he goes away to France.
And it is, I mean, you cover this later in the book, but the paradox of somebody who's known as the greatest popular scientist of his age, but actually only does maths and classics, and yet that somehow also gets to the heart of the kind of man he is. He's not going to be bound by any discipline. He's interested in what he's interested in.
That's right, and he was so proud of this. I mean, many times later he would say that he'd never actually received a formal degree in the sciences. He had never studied for one. Mathematics, a large part of his work in genetics was actually predicated on mathematics and statistics. So he was able in those early years, because genetics was still quite a sort of newborn discipline in the first half of the 20th century. And so there was opportunity and room for him to bring a mathematical eye to bear on genetics. But he knew so much else as well. I mean, he wrote, for example, one of the first, I think, theory on how life might have begun on Earth, which is essentially a product of biochemical reactions. And yet he'd never studied biochemistry in his life. So this was, he had the kind of wide-ranging mind that absorbed information across all sciences and all disciplines. And of course, his degree in the classics stood him in great stead, because every time he would write a paper, he would try, or a book, certainly, he would shoehorn quotations from the classics in there somewhere.
And I guess just to sort of complete the formation of the man, as it were, I mean, he was being formed all his life, but the First World War, the trenches, but then the circuitous way in which he then did a bit of Scotland and then Mesopotamia and India. Do you want to just describe that bit of his First World War experience?
Right. He went away. He was, when he joined up, when he enlisted in the Black Watch, he was sent away to be trained at Nig in Scotland, and then sent first to the front in Flanders, where he was, where he encountered for the first time gas warfare. In fact, his father had been called up by the government to design a gas mask to protect against the chlorine gas attacks that the Germans were unleashing. And so, of course, his father set up a lab. And once again, JBS was one of the guinea pigs who was forced to put on a mask and do sprints in chlorine. And he was injured once in France, sent home and then sent out again to Mesopotamia, injured once again over there. And since he couldn't come back home to England at the time, he was sent to India to recuperate. And he spent nearly a year over there. He recovered, and he was sort of bumming around India a little bit, and he got to see a lot of the country that eventually became his home. And it led him, of course, to some of his political beliefs. I mean, some of the things he says about why the British were there in India at all, and questioning the value of empire to the people who were colonized. These kinds of liberal attitudes, I think he would form and bring back home when he came to the UK.
I also was very struck by he couldn't work out why the British were not so curious about this place. Why were they not learning Urdu? Why were they not learning what they called Hindustani? Why were they not curious? And this really got him going. If you're going to conquer a country, you might at least be interested in it, and they'd sort of lost interest, it seemed to him.
Right. Whereas JBS, he was a regular guy, sort of an invalided soldier who was in Britain, but in India, but he would go to the Legislative Assembly in Delhi and sit and watch the debates. He traveled extensively around the country, even back then. He fell ill a couple of times. He really had sort of a good Indian adventure. He picked up some words of Hindustani, as it was called then. And I think he retained enough fondness for the country to consider moving there in the 1950s, which he eventually did.
So that sort of sets the scene in a way. And let me just say to people who are listening, if you have questions you'd like to put on YouTube, do put them in under the chat function, and I'll try to weave them in the course of the presentation. So he comes back, and he then really starts his career both in genetics, but also his interest in science in general and the place of science in society. So do you want to say a bit about the science on which his reputation really is built, which happened through, I guess, the 20s and 30s?
Sure. So he, the most sort of important work in genetics that he did rests in a series of 10 papers that he wrote while he was at Cambridge. And the papers are essentially a way to knit Darwinism and Mendelism together. So to give people a quick primer, Darwin had written his theories of natural selection and evolution in the middle of the 1800s. Around the same time, Gregor Mendel, the monk, had written out his theories of the gene, of the fact that there are discrete units in our cells that carry these these details of inheritance and the ways in which they combine and recombine determine what the organism looks like and behaves like. But even early in the 1900s, there was no actual way in which these two schools could be knit together. For example, there was no way that Darwinians could figure out how Mendel's theory of the gene could actually help explain natural selection, whether it was powerful enough to explain natural selection, whether the two theories would go together. And the fact that Haldane and a couple of other scientists of the time were mathematicians primarily helped a great deal and achieve what was called the modern synthesis, which was to unite these two theories. And the essence of Haldane's work is sort of a vindication of Darwinian natural selection. It is a way to prove that the theory of the gene and the ways in which genes work, these ways were powerful enough to effect the kind of changes that we see in Darwinian evolution. So that's sort of the broad, we don't have to get into the details, but that's sort of the broad lesson that we take away from his work. And it's extremely important because, as I write in the book, there were several people who were calling Darwinian natural selection sort of dead in the water early in the 1900s. So it was, when they couldn't explain how it worked, they were sort of prepared to look for alternatives. And it was really Haldane and a couple of other people who revived the theory. And along the way, he did a number of other things that was so interesting. I mean, he estimated, for example, he was the first person to estimate the rate at which a human gene might mutate. He was the first person to estimate how genes that are close together on a chromosome, how often they will be inherited together and what effects that'll have in a population. These sound like quite technical details, and certainly they don't have the simple clarity of, for example, Francis and Crick's discovery of the double helix structure of the DNA. But they were very foundational at the time. I think without Haldane's work, the theory of evolution, of natural selection, of genetics, none of these things could have advanced quite in the way that they did.
And then I want to move on a bit to science and politics in a way. And I suppose, can you talk a little bit about eugenics, which clearly now is a word we're not allowed to use, and yet everyone was using in the 20s and 30s, and just the question of how quickly you could make progress in society, how quickly things could change, and the idea that the Darwinian idea of moving very slowly didn't quite fit with the impatience to change society quickly, and how that affected the science of what he was doing.
Right. I mean, it's remarkable how even in the early 1900s, when people knew very little about the gene and how it worked, there were sort of, half-baked theories that were ready to be projected upon the human genome. And they reflected many of the anxieties and insecurities and prejudices of society in that era. So one example is, in the early 1900s, several British sociologists and politicians were quite worried about the sort of virility and strength of the British male. And this was tied directly to how they had fared in the Boer War in South Africa. And so, immediately this question of sort of British fitness, masculine fitness comes into being. And because fitness is something that is a word and a notion that occurs in Darwinian theory as well, but is quite often misinterpreted as just the kind of fitness we understand, physical fitness of one individual. These things are so easily conflated and perverted that people started to come up with all these theories about how to improve the fitness of society. And these took, not surprisingly, forms of, they took racial form, they took, they were prejudiced against the disabled, and things spiraled quickly out of control. In the US, they started sterilizing people they thought unfit, which quite often happened to be African-American people. In the UK, they sequestered them. So you were, as long as you couldn't reproduce, that was what the UK wanted. So close to 60,000 people, I think, were eventually sequestered and not allowed to reproduce because they were deemed unfit. So, and of course, this eventually led to, or sort of also in parallel, led to the racial theories of Nazi Germany. And all of this was, ostensibly, all of these things were sold as ways to develop and groom a better society, a healthier population, a stronger nation. None of these things were, of course, true, and they were all misinterpretations of what genetics actually said. And so Haldane himself grew increasingly forceful about these perversions of genetics theory. And so he went to the US on lecture tours, and he would speak out against the sterilization policies that the US government would follow. He spoke out against the sequestering of the so-called feeble-minded in the UK. And of course, by the time the 1930s came around, he was vociferously and repeatedly writing about Nazi racial theory, decrying decrying the fact that they had any basis in science. I mean, he refused to let people believe that these were genuine scientific theories. And this was a time, obviously, when science is being used or misused for political benefit. This was a time when many other scientists felt the same way about their political beliefs. There were people on the opposing side of the divide as well, I should point out, Tim. I mean, one of Haldane's great contemporaries in mathematical genetics, Ronald Fisher, was, until his dying days, a confirmed eugenicist and a great believer in sort of racial theories and principles of genetic unfitness.
And then let's sort of take that a little bit towards communism and sort of, do you want to just describe again, because there's a brave new world opening up in the Soviet Union with people believing that science is a way to make rapid changes in society. And you have Haldane both very interested in the idea of communism and believing that science should be at the center of a society and the way a society changes. So do you want to describe a little bit the way in which he was engaging in what was happening in the Soviet Union and the scientists of the Soviet Union as well?
Yeah. Well, as we discussed, I mean, JBS's father was a liberal, and he'd been exposed in a way many other boys of his background wouldn't have been. He'd been exposed to men and women of the working class when he was quite young, and of course he went to the trenches. And so I think he had a sort of a vision of classlessness that he quite held dear. And then he moved increasingly leftwards through his years at Cambridge. He married a woman. His first wife was a socialist as well. And then eventually in 1927, he and his wife went to the Soviet Union for the first time, the only time, as it would turn out. And, 1927 was a time at which Stalin's big show trials and purges were only just beginning. They were perhaps not apparent to a casual visitor there, somebody who didn't even speak Russian. So Haldane may not have known too much about what was going on there, but on the flip side, he did see exactly what you described. He did see, at least on the surface, a government and a country that tried its best to organize itself around scientific principles. He saw huge budgets being accorded for the research of scientists, of geneticists and biologists in particular, and he could only sort of compare these to the budgets back home, which were far more paltry. He saw the kind of support that was given to scientists like Nikolai Vavilov, who was his host in the USSR and was an agronomist. And so he came back filled with admiration for this kind of scientifically minded society that he thought the USSR was assembling. And it's easy to look back now and say that he was clearly misguided or that things were heading in a different direction. But I think in 1927, it might be easy for somebody who was already drifting leftwards to fool himself into thinking that this is what was going on. Cut to the 1930s, he moves increasingly leftward. He goes to Spain during the Civil War because he starts to see socialism and communism in particular as a big bulwark against fascism. He sees the Soviet Union in particular as a great counterweight to Nazi Germany. And so he goes to Spain and he supports the Republicans against Franco. And he comes back and eventually becomes a card-carrying member of the British Communist Party in 1942. And so this was, he'd been a fellow traveler by then for a number of years, I guess, and he'd already been speaking about Marxism and writing about dialectical materialism and a whole bunch of other things. But I think it was only in 1942 that he actually signed up to the party officially.
And can we do a little detour into his private life, which is not simply prurient, but I think is relevant to this question of challenging accepted norms, freedom, radical views. Do you want to just do a little bit about Charlotte and how that all happened and what happened with it and Cambridge?
Sure. His first wife, Charlotte, was originally a journalist who'd been sent to interview him. They fell deeply in love and wanted to get married and have children and all of these things, except for the small problem that she was already married. And so what had to happen was that she had to obtain a divorce from her husband so that she could marry JBS. And that was something that Cambridge's extremely prudish establishment did not want happening. There was a committee convened to deliberate on Haldane's case about marrying a divorcee. There were 6 men, there were 6 wise men, which
what were they? They had 6. What was the short name?
Well, they were called the sex viri, which of course JBS took to mean sex weary, and made fun of them in that way. He was kicked out of his position at Cambridge. He appealed. It went to a court in London, and he won his appeal and was reinstated. But this was a kind of anti-establishment figure that JBS was, and he would enjoy sort of going to a Cambridge dinner and loudly talking about how he had to leave early to go meet his mistress. And so this was, he really got under the skin of the Cambridge establishment, I think, and got punished for it in a way, because he never sort of made it beyond being a reader in biochemistry. And he eventually left in great frustration and went to join University College London.
And and of course the British law at the time was also absurd in that if you wanted to get a divorce, you had to have graphic proof that you had been unfaithful. So they had to, am I right, they had to set up a detective to see them going and spending a night in a hotel together in order to get the evidence they needed to get divorced. Is that right?
It was the most ridiculous thing. They had to hire the detective themselves and ask him to tail them to the hotel. They went to the hotel and discovered it wasn't a very nice hotel after all. So they wanted to change hotels, but they had to make sure the detective had caught up to them. So they had to hang around the lobby, ensure that the detective was there, and then lead him on to a different hotel and check in over there so the detective could get the proof that he needed to submit in court.
And can I just quickly take you back to 1924 and the Daedalus, the book that he produced, which in a way, if one were around in the 20s or 30s, this would be the book that people would associate him with, the great confidence about the future and his prediction of the future in science. Do you want to just tell us a bit about that?
I mean, Daedalus is a remarkable essay. He wrote it quite quickly, I think. It was a talk that he gave, and he subsequently turned it into a small book. But he, he posits the fact that the most romantic figure of the coming future will not be the physicist or the poet or anyone else, or the architect, as in Daedalus's case, but will be the biologist who is slowly learning the secrets of life and can unlock these secrets and eventually perhaps manipulate them. And so he posits, the Daedalus, a scientific figure, and the biologist figure in particular, as the center of the coming society. And in the middle of all of this, he predicts a whole bunch of things that eventually make it from his book into real life. I mean, he talks about what he calls ectogenesis, which is the way to grow a baby outside the human body. That was, of course, first borrowed by Aldous Huxley to incorporate into A Brave New World, but it was also sort of a forerunner of the test tube baby in one sense. The fact that the genesis of a zygote itself could happen outside the body before it's implanted back in. So it was sort of it was a short, compact essay that talked about how, as the biologist's role grew, there would have to be a corresponding sense of ethics and morality that would have to be rediscovered or discovered as well to match the biologist's expanding powers. And this was something he would warn about time and time again, which is that science had to come with a growth and development in a sense of ethics.
Goodness me, I'm trying. His life is so full of things. I don't know where to carry on because I think I'll sort of skip Franco and Spanish Civil War because you mentioned that already. But needless to say, he was in the action there as well. Second World War, he was at a stage where he wasn't right at the heart of things, though he lived just north of London. He had these ideas of how to get better Anderson shelters that be more effective. But do you want to just talk a little bit about his work for the British government on submarines at the same time as people were knowing that he was a communist? Because this is one of the things that is really hard to get your mind around. Here's someone who the British state knows he's a member of the British Communist Party. They are following him as MI5 to see whether he's handing secrets over. And yet his reputation is so great that he's also being employed by the British government to look at some of the most military, most secret or sensitive areas of all, isn't he?
And that isn't the only contradiction. I think also the contradiction is that JBS, who would criticize the British government vociferously by day, would also then sort of go into a research facility in the evenings or in the mornings to conduct experiments on himself to help the same government in the war. So, I mean, it was, there were several contradictions that were rife through his life in the Second World War. But the research he was doing essentially was, the British were building a number of submarines, but obviously submarine conditions were not quite as well understood then as they are today. And so when a submarine sank, people didn't know what would happen to the sailors, how long they could survive below the water, how long a rescue effort would have to raise the submarine back or get the sailors out. And so Haldane and a very small team of researchers was given the task of finding all of this out. And they did this essentially by building a large pressure chamber and putting themselves into the chamber day after day, tweaking the mixture of gases, tweaking the pressure and temperature settings, and testing it upon themselves and kind of seeing what the effects on the human body were. And very often they were quite severe. I mean, they would throw up, they would pass out, they would have seizures, quite, very similar to epileptic seizures. And Haldane himself, for the longest time, for the rest of his life, in fact, suffered from something called Kummel's disease, which is there was a small bubble of air that had settled at the base of his spine, cut off the blood supply to the last two bones, then the bones turned necrotic. And so he would never again be able to sit without a cushion between himself and his chair because his back gave him problems. So these were the kind of experiments that Haldane conducted over the better part of 2 years. And he wrote up these reports for the British Navy and helped improve submarine conditions and improve the Navy's knowledge of what happened to men and women when they were underwater.
I suppose also this, what dates was that? Is that still during the war we're talking?
It was sort of it was about 1941 to 1943. I think. That's when it stopped.
It's at a point where the Soviet Union is in theory still the British ally. So I suppose it's not working with the enemy yet, but attitudes towards communism were going to move fairly fast, and everyone knew it was a sort of a marriage of convenience. And then let's go forward a bit into the sort of the later 40s, and just the point where his politics and his science started to push in different directions, and particularly judgments on Stalin and what was going on in the Soviet Union. His political loyalty to the concept of what the Soviet Union could be, sort of trumping what his science should have told him.
I think that's right. I mean, I think there was one moment in his life when he made the wrong decision, when he was asked to choose between his scientific integrity and his political loyalty, and that happened in 1948 with the so-called Lysenko affair, when he was, Lysenko was an agronomist in the Soviet Union, and on Stalin's behest, he advanced a completely sort of inaccurate view of genetics. And of how evolution works and how genetics works. But then more importantly, he also carried out numerous purges of any scientist who disagreed with him. And so all of these reports filtered back to the UK, and Haldane, as the country's leading communist intellectual of the time, was repeatedly asked about his views on Lysenko. And I think, as I find out in the book, based on reviewing his private correspondence as well as his public statements, I think he decided at the time that it was for the greater good that he sort of defend Lysenko in public, even as he disagreed with his party colleagues in private. But that was a mistake. I think Lysenko's science was so flawed that it still remains sort of the one and only big stain on Haldane's record when we look back at it. And so, I'd read about the Lysenko affair earlier. I hadn't known about his quite active and hectic disagreements with his party colleagues about what the party's stand should be on Lysenko. And it is to his credit that he sort of called them out on their blind defense of Lysenko's science. But it is also to his discredit that this was the one time that he chose to defend a flawed science in public.
And in a way, we're used nowadays to scientists who see themselves operating entirely outside a political environment and for whom science is pure and simple, whereas he always believed that science was in a social context and that he clearly got it wrong there. But that connection between science and society is something that was a valuable part of who he was and should perhaps in future be a part of how we view science as well.
I think that's right. And of course, it wasn't just JBS, although he was the most shining exemplar of that. But I think there was so many scientists of that time who had a really keen sense of how their science fit into a larger social and political structure. And, in the book, I speculate as to why this might be. One reason that I came up with is the fact that scientists just had a broader base of education back then. Haldane himself, as we discussed, did not have a degree in the sciences, and that was unusual. But there were several others who would have studied classics and would have studied languages and would have studied history and several other things before they came to specialize in a particular kind of science. Whereas today, scientists tell me if you know you want to be a scientist in a particular discipline, you have to start thinking about how to work your way towards that specialization right from the very first year of university. Whose lab do you intern in? What kind of work do you do? What kind of skills do you pick up? And maybe part of that is a natural byproduct of just how specialized science has become, and it's unavoidable. But another part is definitely, there's something missing in the fact that scientists aren't often trained in the humanities. C.P. Snow's big theory of these two cultures and not meeting at all. I think those two cultures have only diverged since he wrote about them in the about 40 or 50 years ago.
We had a big debate in the college a year and a half ago, I think, between those who argued, and they were essentially anthropologists and development economists, that everything is subjective and that the interest comes in different human views of particular areas, and those who said that there is science.
Right.
And there is good science and there's bad science, but good science is the science that strips away all of the biases that your society builds in. It sounds as though, I guess in the book, you're slightly more on the side of saying that there is no such thing as science which is not done by humans, and therefore, by definition, it's going to bring a certain number of biases to it.
I think scientific principles are embedded and implicit in the universe, and scientists work to unearth them. But science and scientific research themselves, those are human activities. They are subject to funding and politics and preconceived biases and laziness and temperament and so many other things. All the things that affect human beings affect scientific research. And so I think it's only by seeing that and recognizing that and making allowances for that that we can really sort of prize scientific research as an activity. If we continue to believe that it is by itself a pure, pristine thing, we will just fail to see the number of ways in which it can be led astray.
So can we then move back into his life story? And in a way, this is the point. He's well-established globally. People know who he is. He's made his reputation. He could very happily settle back in, Oxford or Cambridge or Harpenden or wherever he wants to settle back and, look at his expert areas. but he decides to go to India in this sort of wonderful coda in some ways to his life. He's got a new woman in his life, but can you explain a little bit about what took him to India? Because there's politics as well as science involved in that as well, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, as with JBS, there were a number of factors. One was something as banal and mundane as money. I think University College London found that it was strapped for cash after the Second World War. It was having to rebuild a large part of its campus. It got to the point that Haldane himself was shelling out his own money to buy teaspoons for the common room or supplies for the lab. So that was one aspect of it. He himself was paying alimony to his first wife. So I think there was an acute financial angle to Haldane's move. But then also after the Lysenko affair and after his resignation from the Communist Party of Great Britain, I think he felt a certain vacuum, like an ideological sort of severance with a group that he had really considered himself to be an active participant in. And he was looking for another great cause to throw his weight behind. And India at that time presented something like that. I mean, India in Nehru's time, soon after its independence, was fiercely socialist, although not to the extent, but it wasn't sort of an anti-democratic kind of socialism the way the Soviet Union was. Nehru also believed that science should sit at the center of social planning and economic planning. And so India had set up all of these centers where expertise could be relied upon to help plan the country's economy and its society. And I think all of this appealed enormously to Haldane. I think he must have seen India as this big, new socialist experiment that he wanted to be a part of. And so he wangled a position at an institute in Calcutta, and he moved there in 1957. Of course, when he was leaving, he pretended to have a big political reason for his move, which was that Britain was involved in the Suez Crisis and in attacking Egypt at the time. But of course, he had made up his mind about the move well before the Suez Crisis had started. And of course, there's the immortal line that he gave a reporter about another reason for his move, which is 60 years in socks is enough.
Yeah, it's a wonderful quote, isn't it? And he did create in India for himself, moving around a little bit, a real life. I mean, he found himself a bit frustrated by the bureaucracy in various places, but he did appear to be extremely happy in his life in India. He chose to be an Indian citizen.
He did. He got the passport. He dressed like an Indian. He ate like an Indian. He stopped eating meat. He was genuinely sort of, as only a biologist can be. I think he was entranced by the wide variety and diversity in India's flora and fauna. And so he went back to a much older way in which biology and genetics were practiced, by which I mean that he and his students would try to hybridize plants and animals, would try to track their genetic traits in the way that Mendel had done, decades before that. In the West, genetics was moving more towards molecular biology, so you needed all these big fancy machines to run experiments, and India couldn't afford that, and Haldane couldn't afford that, and so he moved into this older form of genetics research instead. But he truly enjoyed himself. I mean, he was in Calcutta, then he moved further down the coast to Bhubaneswar, which is where he died. And at no point ever in any of his letters did I find the slightest sort of desire to move back to England and to be there in his last few years.
And there's a phrase I've written down from, I think it's from you writing it, that India was less censorious of human variety. And he clearly is somebody who found England of the time just a little bit too suffocating, because it had its social ideas of what was right ways of behaving. And he found in India, partly, I guess, being a foreigner in India, even though he had an Indian nationality, the freedom to just be his self. And there's a lovely, I mean, we love Isaiah Berlin because he was our first president here at Wolfson. And there's a lovely letter that he writes to Isaiah Berlin encouraging him to come over to visit him in India. but he knows that, he says he thinks that the diet may be a little bit Dravidian because he's taken up vegetarianism, and he's sure he can, whatever it is, the fatted calf can be slaughtered, etc. But he clearly loved the permissive environment that he found in India at the time.
And I think even intellectually, I think he found that it was quite sort of fertile. India at the time, these institutes that he was in would attract scientists from around the world. They would attract extremely bright graduate students whom he wanted to work with. And so it was really sort of a kind of blossoming environment that I think maybe he found Oxford and Cambridge to not be at the time. These were old institutions. They had their set ways of doing things. I think Haldane in India found that he was still in institutions where he could make a difference and where he could sort of influence the way in which research and science were done.
One of the things I found throughout that life is he clearly was full of energy and seriousness and breadth of vision and challenge, and was a bit cantankerous. But I didn't get a strong sense of humor. I mean, he occasionally joked about the Cambridge guys. And then towards the end of his life, he produces this poem that is one of the most amusing as well as ghoulish poems about his colorectal cancer. I've got a copy here. Can I read a little bit just in case?
You should.
People were really, I mean, I won't read the whole thing because it's about 2 pages, but it just, so he starts, "I wish I had the voice of Homer to sing of rectal carcinoma, which kills a lot more chaps, in fact, than were bumped off when Troy was sacked. I noticed I was passing blood, only a few drops, not a flood. So pausing on my homeward way from Tallahassee to Bombay, I asked a doctor, now my friend, to peer into my hinder end to disprove the rumor that I had a malignant tumor." And it goes on, and it ends with this lovely, "Provided one confronts the tumor with a sufficient sense of humor, I know that cancer often kills, but so do cars and sleeping pills, and it can hurt one till one sweats. So can bad teeth and unpaid debts. A spot of laughter, I am sure, often accelerates one's cure. So let us patients do our bit to help the surgeons make us fit." I mean, is it wonderful? Absolutely amazing.
It's great. Although I have to say, JBS always had a huge sense of humor, and I think he was very witty. I remember even when he was in Eton in school, he and his sister would set these little general knowledge quizzes that they would administer to people who they knew. So one of the questions I remember was Virgil really the mother of our Lord, as depicted in the painting, the Virgil and Child? There were all these like little puns. He loved wordplay. And so I remember he set a genetics exam for students, discussed the genetics of local races, illustrating your answer from the university boat race. Account for the dominance of light blue over dark blue. This is something that I'm sure Oxford, people at Oxford will appreciate.
So we're coming to the end of our time, and looking back now, how should we appraise him? Because he is a name. I mean, we in Wolfson keep his name alive, and we have a Haldane lecture every year, and we have a room that's called the Haldane Room. But it's, one can also feel that he's very much from another age. So how relevant is he to what we are doing now, both in our attitude to science as well as his scientific ideas?
Well, I think his scientific work is considered so fundamental now that often we don't even recognize that we're dealing with Haldane's work when we work in genetics. I mean, his theories they form bedrock of the science. But I think for most of us, his relevance comes in the form of how he thought about the intersections of science and politics. And we have to sort of recognize that science is not an apolitical endeavor. And I think scientists are beginning to recognize that. They've started seeing the ways in which politicians and governments misrepresent fact. And this has particularly happened since 2016, for reasons that we're all aware of. And I think there's a certain sort of deeper engagement with the public sphere that scientists are slowly beginning to adopt, which is a welcome change. I mean, I think it didn't happen for a long time. And I think the fact that it's happening now is something that should be appreciated, and we need more of it. So I think that's, to the lay, to you and me and to people who read the book, every time we think about science as an enterprise, we need to sort of be thinking about the context in which it exists. And the last year has provided a perfect example of this. The ways in which vaccine research have unfolded. Who gets vaccines first? Where are they developed? Where are they manufactured? Who funds? Who funds these vaccines? Who makes profits from these vaccines? I mean, all of these are intensely political questions. And Haldane would have been on sort of TV all year last year, I think, like talking about some of these subjects. And I think sort of at a more minor level, I do know that there is a blue plaque for John Scott Haldane in Oxford, but there isn't a blue plaque for JBS anywhere in the country. So, maybe that's a start. Sort of a blue plaque for him is something that the country really needs.
Okay, well, that's a very good prompt for us to get away and try to. We have got a blue plaque on one of our neighbours here just next to the college, but we haven't got one at the college itself. So maybe we need to make sure that happens. Samantha, it's been a real pleasure to talk to you. I mean, you are very engaging. The book is just extraordinarily engaging about the individual, this extraordinary man who made such a difference to so many people. But thank you for your time. It's lovely to see you. And I'm sorry we're having to do this down the line, but when the pandemic comes to an end and our dinner hall opens, we would love to have you coming to see us in college for real.
That would be fantastic. Thank you so much, Tim. This has been so enjoyable, and thank you for inviting me to do this. I really loved it.
Great. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for taking part in this presentation. Thank you very much indeed. Have a good night.